We'll play ICI motto also. Yashwant, ready?
Please are joining, I guess. We'll give some time.
Yeah, let them join.
Yes.
I think we can get started. We are already live, Yashwant.
Yes.
Start, Yashwant.
Ishraji, please play the ICI motto song first.
य एष सुप्तेषु जाग्रति य एष सुप्तेषु जाग्रति कामं 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 कामपुरुषो पुरुषो निर्विमाणः निर्विमाणः तदेव शुक्रं तद्ब्रह्मा तद्ब्रह्मा तदेवामृतमुच्यते तस्मिन् लोकः शतः सर्वे तदूनात्यति कश्चन एतद्द्वैता 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 एतद्द्वैता.
Yes, Srikanth, you can start.
Thank you everyone for joining. Am I audible to everyone? Right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. Today we have meet in the evening for the seminar on GST registration, suspension, cancellation, and revocation. Since implementation of GST, it has been a roller coaster ride in relation to various compliances, many issues, because this being a system-driven law, implementation was that very difficult. But we as practicing chartered accountants have made it possible. We have stood by our words, alphabets of trust. Even government has a great trust on us, and we have stood by. In today's evening, I welcome today's gathering. I first of all welcome our honorable chairperson, CA Murtuja Kachwala sir, who is chairperson WIRC. Then I welcome CA Yashwant Kasar, Vice Chairman WIRC and GST Committee Chairperson. I also welcome CA Ashish Kedia sir, who is the faculty today for us to guide on these issues. I welcome you all. And I now request Chairperson CA Murtuja Kachwala sir to address the gathering. Sir, please.
Thank you, Srikanth. Good afternoon to all. I welcome all the participants to this program today. At the outset, let me first thank C. Ashish Kedia, faculty for today. Ashish, thank you very much for accepting the invitation and agreeing to share your knowledge with all the participants. Thank you, Ashish. Let me also thank Srikanth for being the coordinator today, and really grateful to the chairman of GST committee, Yashwant Kasar, and vice chairman Gautam Lad for organizing series of programs on GST, which will covering small matters. And today, an interesting subject again, registration of GST, practically what is required to be done, what are the challenges which comes, if you get stuck, how do you handle it? I am sure Ashish is going to cover a lot of them. Also on suspension, cancellation, revocation. And we also requested Ashish to keep about 20-25 minutes towards the end, maybe 15 minutes to answer questions as well. So I would encourage the participants to keep typing the questions into the chat box, and we will accumulate all of them and present to Ashish once he completes, so that we can get you answers for your practical questions as well. Friends at WIRC, this year, the focus is to bring as many areas of practice to the membership as possible. And we are organizing multiple refresher courses on internal audit, on risk management, valuation, insolvency, cooperative, even in IPO listing. So like what are the various areas where CS can practice, they can contribute and they can support their client and add value. So anyone wants to pick up something in addition to what they're doing right now, it enables them to do that. And in this refresher course, which are 12 to 15 hours, 18 hours, 24 hours, we are even trying to bring about practical ways of empanelment and practical ways of doing work. That way, in addition to that, one of the other second goal at WIRC this year is to enable the members in terms of technology. So trying to create some tools which can be made available to members free of cost. Trying to identify softwares where we can tie up and make it available to members at a concessional rate. And also we are organizing multiple shorter duration courses as well as longer duration courses on technology so that members can attend and learn from there. Before I close, just wanted to bring to notice of members about two important events which are coming ahead. On 13th and 14th of May, we are organizing a national conference on internal audit at BKC ICI Bhavan at Mumbai, and it will be in hybrid program, physical as well as virtual. I would encourage members to try and register and attend this. And biggest event of WIRC in the year is the regional conference. And this year we are doing the regional conference at Pune on 3rd and 4th of June. And excellent faculties Yashwanta's planned, and also with 4 panel discussions. I would request all the members and encourage you to join us for the regional conference at Pune on 3rd and 4th of June. So with that, happy learning to all of you. Thank you very much. And over to you again, Shrikant. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your insights and the upcoming events you have discussed. This will be very much helpful for all the fraternity members. I now request C. Yashwant Kasar, who is Vice Chairman of WIRC and the GST Committee Chairperson, to please address the gathering. Yashwant, sir, over to you.
Thank you, Shrikant. Good evening, friends. Chairman Murtuza Bhai, today's faculty Ashish Bhai, all the participants present over here. Good evening to all of you. Friends, WIRC is a vibrant region of ICI, and this GST committee of WIRC is one of such vibrant committee which keep on organizing various programs on various subject areas on the relevant matters for the members at large. And yes, this is one of such program where our today's faculty will deliberate on various aspects of registration. At WIRC, what we are doing this year at under GST committee, I will just briefly I would like to tell you that we are planning various programs, and one such program I can tell about is about sectoral series, which will be coming up from next week or so, and we will be covering 20 sectors and the implications of GST on those 20 sectors, so that every week we'll be covering one sector and 20 sectors will be covering in that sectoral series. Apart from that, litigation in GST will be a big area henceforth, and it has already started. So to prepare our members to be ready for that litigation practice, we are arranging a litigation series also, and there will be 10 sessions series for litigation, and we will repeat it again. So in next 15 days, we will be starting with our litigation series as well. There will be excellent speaker for both this sectoral series as well as litigation series. And I would request all the participants to also take part in that litigation as well as sectoral series. Apart from that, we are releasing 2 publications of WIRC on GST front in next week. One publication is on Schedule 3, that is transaction which will not be regarded as supply. So that will be a crisp publication, very handy for all the members, covering the implications of the Schedule 3 of the GST Act. And of course, for Maharashtra state, they have launched amnesty scheme for the Maharashtra state amnesty scheme, second version. So we are coming up with the publication on that matter also. It's under finalization. It's in the final stage. Very soon we will be launching that publication for the members at large. Apart from that, if the members feel that this is the topic that we should come up with the publication, please let us know at WRC. To any office bearers or any regional council members, please reach out to us so that we can take ahead that project. Apart from that, any other program that you want on GST front or any other area for us to organize, please let us know. And before closing, again, I will appeal all of you, as Chairman Sir said, we will be having our regional conference on 3rd and 4th of June at Pune. It will be a good, very nice gathering and physical conference with a very good lineup of speakers, very good topics. So do register for that regional conference as well. So with this, I will stop here and wish all of you happy learning.
Thank you, Yashwant. Thank you so much. Already the questions have started flooding in the inbox. People are very much eager to hear you, Ashish sir. Let me introduce today's speaker. Ashish Kedia sir has been practicing as a partner in the firm AB Kedia and Associates. He has been in the past associated with indirect tax practice for Big Fours. He has participated in various national and international moot court competitions. He has been regularly authoring various GST articles. He has also a radio talk shows pertaining to GST. He's a regular speaker at various forums of ICI and on the indirect taxes. He has addressed more than 50 seminars across India on GST. He has co-opted member of Indirect Tax Committee of WRC of ICI. I welcome you, sir. Many attendees are very much eager to hear you. Over to you, sir. Please proceed.
Thank you so much, Shrikantji, for the kind introduction. A very warm good evening to all of you who are attending this session. I think this is a very practical, session where there isn't too much as such, learning involved in terms of the law, but I think more of the learning is involved in terms of the procedure that we are required. But I think, what I will do is I will take up the provisions of the law, because ultimately and essentially it is the law which we need to understand. And once we have understood the law, the practical aspects are thereby taken care of together along with it. So with this in mind, I think we'll just start our session. I'll just share my screen. I hope the screen is visible to all. So, as I said, what we will do is we'll try and understand the law. I know the topic for the day is all about registrations. The other aspects, as are indicated in the title, which is the cancellation or the revocation or the suspension of registration, are obviously again related to registration only. So basically what we need to do is we need to understand the subject of registration, and all other topics are ancillary to the topic of registration. Now, when we are talking about registration, if I don't know how many of us, I think most of us who would be attending today would have started the GST practice probably once GST had set in as a new law. And way back probably in 2017, 2018, 2019 maybe, registrations were not at all a difficult task. And GST registrations was something that were very forthcoming.
आशीष सर,
हाँ,
आपका स्क्रीन पूरा विजिबल नहीं है, कमेंट्स आ रहे हैं.
एक सेकेंड ना, सॉरी, अभी विजिबल है?
नहीं, फुल स्क्रीन नहीं हुआ है.
एक मिनट. अभी मिश्रा जी ठीक है?
नहीं
So
सर,
it's
वापस आधा
getting
हो गया.
sliced. It's getting sliced. Please
Nice.
do it on presentation mode, I guess. Yes, Ashish sir, you can continue. We are getting comments. Yes, now visible.
Okay. Is it coming as a slideshow or is it coming as a draft mode?
It's on the draft mode itself, not on the slideshow.
Okay. Just 1 minute. Let me try if I can set up for the slideshow. It's half of it only. Okay, I think I'll maybe just continue like this. I don't know why.
Yes, yes, this one is fine, sir. You can continue.
Okay. So, as I said, registrations was not a very big challenge, and the other aspects also of registration were not that much of a challenge when we started off with this process. The issues started arising over the last 2-3 years, and I think I would categorize the issues into two main, baskets. One are the practical aspects that we are facing from the officers' end. So the officers under GST who are processing the registrations, we have been getting a lot of queries and a lot of rejections, in fact, to say, when we are making registration applications. Even to the extent that when we are making applications for amendment of registration, even in those instances, there are times when the application for amendments are also rejected. So this was something which was never happening in the past. And obviously, the second category of issues are those issues where, I would say mainly because we have progressed in the GST law and 4-5 years have passed by of return filing, etc. Now there have been, problems arising due to those non-compliances or faulty compliances which have happened in the past. So probably to again, put it in that manner, one is the issues that we are facing because of the officers, raising objections, and second are the issues that we are facing due to the taxpayers' problems, which would have arisen because of their past actions, and we now need to handle those issues. Now, just to take up the main provision of registration, what is the liability of registration? Let us first look at it and understand when is a person required to get registered under GST. So section 19 is the section where basically we have been told what and when is the event where we have to take registration. Now, if you look at that, you will basically understand that there are 3 types of registration. There are 3 cases in which registration is done. One is the mandatory registration. That is all, as most of us would know, when you cross a particular limit under GST, you need to go and apply for a registration. The second is when you don't cross that limit, as we commonly know and as we commonly hear, that limit is of 20 lakhs. So until you've crossed that limit of 20 lakhs, you have not been forced by the government to come and take a registration. So if you have not been told under the law to take a registration, you are then going and suo moto taking a registration. You are applying for a voluntary registration, right? So in that case, again, you go and apply for a registration and you obtain a registration under GST. The third is a forceful registration, I would say, where the officer forcefully gives you a registration. Now, obviously, as you understand, this is because there have been non-compliances in the past, and those non-compliances have resulted in the officer saying that you've crossed the mandatory limit, or there was some other provision in the GST law which was making you liable to registration, and thereby you have not taken a registration and paid due taxes to the government, right? So this is a third scenario where the officer, even without you applying for a registration, will process a registration on their own and tell you to comply with the law. Now, having understood the three, areas under which we might be given a registration, let us understand when it comes to mandatory registration, which is the very basic thing. When is it that you are required to go and yourself apply for a registration? Otherwise, the consequences of non-compliance would follow. Now, please understand, when we are talking about registration, the basic incidence of registration is tax, right? I'm sorry. The basic incidence of registration is relating to the event of supply. Whenever the supply of goods is made, that is the point of time where you will need to take a registration, right? Now, when we talk about supply, what we need to do is we need to look at the definition of supply. The definition of supply, if you see, is quite broad, right? So we need to look at that definition of supply, which is defined in section 7. And also along with that, if we see, the definition would refer us to look at 3 more schedules, which is schedule 1, schedule 2, and schedule 3, right? So if I'm to look at the definition of supply, I would see that there would be these basic characteristics which are contained in the definition of supply. So as is appearing to you on the screen, it would include all forms of supply of goods and services, such as sale, transfer, barter, exchange, license, rental, or disposal, right? So if you see, they have used various terminologies. Now, since the session is not really on supply, I will not go and technically vivisect each of these terminologies or the words. But what we try and understand is that it covers various incidences due to which a liability on account of GST might occur. So if there is any form of transaction, since this is a transaction-based tax, if you see, they've tried to cover it from all aspects, and thereby the sale, transfer, barter, exchange, rental, lease, disposal, usage of these words would cover all kinds of transactions which probably we can imagine. What is important is, however, to note that when we talk about supply, the supply needs to be made for a consideration, right? So when the consideration is there, only in that case, I mean, there needs to be quid pro quo, right? So unless there is a quid pro quo, there will not be a incidence of supply, and thereby there will be no tax implication. So only when there is a supply and there is a consideration against the supply would we be talking about supply in terms of GST law. The third aspect that we need to also look at is it needs to be in the course of furtherance of business. So whenever you are looking at a supply, please look at it from the context of business, whether it is being done to further a business transaction or not. If it is relating to a personal transaction, then in that case, we don't get attracted under this definition of supply. Apart from that, as we all know, even in the case of import of services, where there's a cross-border transaction and we are asking some person residing outside India to supply services to us, in such cases also, wherever services have been imported, there is a incidence of supply in terms of GST law. And this goes to the extent of saying that even if it is not in the course of furtherance of business, it would still constitute supply. So you will need to be very careful when you're dealing with cross-border transactions, because in such cases, the tax incidence is quite wide. Apart from that, as I said, the definition would ask you to refer to 3 more schedules: Schedule 1, Schedule 2, and Schedule 3. Schedule 1 is where they have defined certain activities which would result in supply even when the consideration is absent. So as we discussed, generally the incidence of tax would arise on a supply which is made for a consideration. However, they have carved out certain exceptions, in which cases the supply made without a consideration would also be considered to be a supply which results in tax under GST law. One such example is supply between related persons. So whenever you are dealing with related parties, it is possible that there might not be a consideration since it is your own group concern, right? Thereby, in such cases, the government has said that even if it is a transaction between related persons which does not have consideration involved, we would still call it a supply for which tax is liable to be paid. Coming on to the second category, which is Schedule 2, which talks about basically deemed supply. Now, there could be, as probably some of us would know, in the historical or in the legacy laws, which was the VAT and the service tax, there were some transactions on which there was a litigation involved, and the government had to, and thereby in such cases, come out with a deeming provision, a law which said that whether or not this is a transaction of supply of goods or a supply of service, it will still attract VAT or service tax. In order to continue the same position under GST, they came out with Schedule 2, wherein they have defined certain supplies which are deemed to be supplies. And they have said that when we are deeming it to be a supply, we would also categorize for you whether it is a supply of goods or a supply of service. Because whenever we would be talking about GST laws, it is also important for us to make distinction between a supply into a supply of goods or supply of service. So not only does this schedule deem a particular supply to be a supply, it will also categorize them between goods and services. I have given you some examples which are composite supply of food. So example, if you go to a restaurant, then in that case, not only is there a service involved, there is also a food element involved. So it's a mixture of goods and services both. In such cases, there might be a dispute whether there is a supply or not. However, the government has said it's a deemed supply and it has categorized that as a service. Similarly, another example could be works contract. We are all familiar with what is a works contract. And thereby, even in such cases, since there were disputes in the past, they have categorized this as a deemed supply, which results in a service. Lastly, coming to the third schedule, this third schedule is basically all those list of items which are neither supply of goods nor supply of service. So if we have to look at Schedule 3 and contrast it with Schedule 1 and Schedule 2, Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 are basically inclusions to the definition of supply, whereas Schedule 3 is basically an exclusion to the definition of supply. So anything that is said in Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 would make you liable to include that in the turnover and pay tax on it. Whereas items listed in Schedule 3 are those which can be taken out from the turnover, and thereby they are not liable to tax and they do not constitute a supply in the first case. Examples of such items are any services which are rendered in the course of employment. So whenever there is an employer-employee relationship, it could still be said that there is a provision of service. However, to remove doubts on such transactions and to keep them safely out of GST, it is categorically stated in Schedule 3 that these are services which are in the course of employment, which are neither supply of goods nor supply of service. Similarly, funeral services, etc. Now, having understood this, what we need to look at is that registration is only required when there is a transaction which results in a supply. As I said, supply would need to be inferred by looking at the Section 7 definition of supply. Along with that, as I said, Section 7 would also ask you to refer Schedule 1, 2, and 3. We have already covered all of this. Once you have, assured yourself that this particular transaction that I'm looking at is a supply in terms of Section 7, what you would need to do is you would need to understand where is the liability of registration arising. Now, GST law, despite being a pan-India law, the registration is a state-specific registration. So you would need to arrive at a decision as to in which state you would have to take registration, right? So that is the second thing you would have to do. How to do that? We'll come to it a bit later. And once you have decided on these two things and are assured of the fact that whatever decisions you have made are now making you liable for registration, it is your duty to apply for a registration within 30 days of you becoming liable. Now, as we discussed, when we are talking about mandatory registration, the mandatory registration is required to be done once you cross a particular threshold. in terms of turnover. The technical word that they have used is aggregate turnover. So once you cross a particular amount of aggregate turnover, then all those supplies which are taxable and have resulted in you making you cross the aggregate turnover of more than 20 lakhs are those which are going to be liable for tax. So effectively what the government has said is that first 20 lakhs of supply are not going to be liable for tax. Now, what is this aggregate turnover and how to arrive at this aggregate turnover is also laid down. They have defined the aggregate turnover terminology, which we will look to in the next slide. But for now, I hope it is clear that the limit which is required to be crossed for mandatory registration is a limit of 20 lakhs. There are exceptions to this limit as well, wherein the government has said that this limit of 20 lakhs would not be applicable in a particular case. We will cover those exceptions also. And there are exceptions where this limit of 20 lakhs has been reduced to 10 lakhs. These are certain special category states. These states are Manipur, Mizoram, Nagaland, and Tripura. Earlier, the list contained some more states. I think around 12, 13 states were there in the list. However, from 2019 onwards, we have only these 4 states now, which are considered as special category states, for which the turnover, the aggregate turnover limit is of 10 lakhs. So if you have to take registration under these states, please keep in mind that your aggregate turnover, once it crosses 10 lakhs, that is when you will have to go and immediately take a registration. Now, as we said, let us first understand what do we mean by this term aggregate turnover. Aggregate turnover, I have simplified it for you and have kept it in this table and made it simple to understand what is included and what is excluded. So let us look at what is included first in the aggregate turnover. So when you're trying to calculate aggregate turnover, obviously the first thing that you are required to include is all your taxable supplies. So anything that has some amount of tax, any supply that has any amount of tax onto it, obviously that is required to be included. Apart from that, what is also required to be included is all your exempt supplies. That is the third item in my table. Now, exempt supplies is again defined, right? And exempt supplies not only includes zero rated supplies or those supplies which are exempt by a specific notification, it would also include non-taxable supplies, right? So when we are talking about aggregate turnover, we are including taxable supplies, we are including exempt supplies, and we are also including those transactions which are categorized as non-taxable transactions, right? The fourth category is exports of goods and services. Now, export of goods and services, if some of us are not clear with the technical difference, ideally we know that there is no tax on export of goods and services. However, please understand they are not exempt supplies, they are zero rated supplies, and thereby technically they need to be distinguished vis-a-vis the exempt supplies, right? So thereby to even cover the turnover of export transactions, government has specifically included export of goods and services under the definition of aggregate turnover. So effectively you will think that everything is included, because once I have said that not only exempt supplies, but also non-taxable supplies are required to be covered, then what is it that gets left out? The thing that gets left out is, first of all, the tax. So if you are talking about the GST law, commonly we refer to the rate as 18%. So what they're saying is that when you're counting aggregate turnover, it will be only 100 and not 118 rupees of turnover that needs to be included. So the tax amount in the transaction is something you can conveniently ignore. But when we're talking about taxes, it's only the tax under the GST that you are required to ignore. All other taxes will still form part of the aggregate turnover. Second thing that you can ignore is the inward supplies on which tax is liable to be paid under reverse charge mechanism. Now, I'm sure every one of us is familiar with reverse charge mechanism under GST law. So all those supplies on which you have paid tax as a recipient of that supply, that is the supply that you don't require to include. because you have been forced to pay tax on this supply, but it was never your supply, right? You never rendered those services, right? So thereby those supplies are required to be excluded from the aggregate turnover, and fairly so. Value of inward supplies, again, as I said, whatever are your inward supplies are not your transactions which have been entered into. They have only been done as a matter of purchase transactions or expense transactions, right? So you have not rendered these services, and thereby aggregate turnover would exclude those. Coming to the last one is the no supply cases. So as I said, any transaction in GST needs to be categorized as a transaction of goods or a transaction of service. Any transaction that does not satisfy the definition of section 7 is a no supply transaction, right? Because it is neither a service nor goods, and thereby it has not resulted in supply in itself, right? If I have to distinguish between non-taxable supplies and no supplies, I'll give you a simple example. Alcohol. Alcohol is covered within the ambit of GST. It is a supply, but it is not being taxed under GST. Whereas a no supply transaction would probably be something like, say, for example, maybe shares, transactions in shares, because these are neither goods nor services, and thereby such transactions cannot be made liable to tax under GST, right? Similarly, maybe transactions in money involving loans and advances. These are again transactions which are not supply because they are neither goods nor service. Now, having understood this, let us understand certain clarifications that they have given to understand what is to be also included in the aggregate turnover. Now, where there is a relationship between two parties as principal and agent, in such cases, again, what you will need to do is any supplies between the principal and agent would also be regarded as a supply, and thereby it would need to be included in the aggregate turnover definition or the aggregate turnover computation. Now, typically, what happens is, again, it is very difficult to understand where there is a nature of principal and agent. Where is this agency relationship existing, and in which of such cases you are required to calculate those transactions under the aggregate turnover. So these confusions were, they were represented to CBIC, and CBIC had come out with a circular saying that in order to ascertain whether a person who is an agent is entering into a transaction as an agent or not, meaning to say that whether he has the right to represent a certain person as his principal, and he is entering into that transaction by stepping into the shoes of a principal, is something that you will need to ascertain. However, again, doing that would be a very complicated and a subjective exercise. Thereby, in order to reduce any kind of confusion and to make things clear and arrive at this particular turnover in an objective manner rather than subjective manner, they said that wherever the agent issues an invoice in his own name, stating that he has entered into this transaction on behalf of the principal, but the invoice is being issued by him, then in such cases, that particular transaction will be counted as his aggregate turnover. However, say for example, Mr. A has appointed Mr. B as an agent. Now Mr. B is supplying goods to Mr. C. At the time of negotiation with Mr. C, this agent, Mr. B, told C that the goods that I will be sending you would directly come from Mr. A. So the goods will be dispatched from Mr. A to Mr. C. Billing would also happen from Mr. A to Mr. C. There will be no involvement as such of Mr. B except for sourcing this transaction from Mr. A. Then in such cases, B as the agent is not required to include these amount of goods in his aggregate turnover. I hope it is clear, right? If I take it the other way around, now imagine the case where the transaction was done with Mr. C and Mr. B told Mr. C that these goods are those which are being supplied by Mr. A. However, it is me who will do the billing to you, right? So when in this case, the goods will come from Mr. B and the billing will also be done from Mr. B. And Mr. A is not directly entering into the picture when this dealing with Mr. C is happening. In such cases, the principal, Mr. B, will need to include this amount of transaction in his aggregate turnover. So the value of goods supplied in this transaction would form part of value in the case of Mr. A as well as value in the case of Mr. B, right? Similarly, there could be another confusion. That confusion could arise in the case of principal job worker relationship. So whenever the job worker hands over the goods to the principal, the goods have undergone some value addition. So confusion could arise saying that whether the value of goods is also to be included in the turnover of job worker, or whether when we are calculating the turnover of the job worker, this particular value of goods is not required to be included, and only the value addition done by the job worker is required to be included. Again, to solve this problem, it has been categorically laid out in the law that when it comes to job worker, only the value addition will be considered in the hands of the job worker, right? I hope this makes the aggregate turnover word clear. As we discussed, once the aggregate turnover exceeds 20 lakhs, then you are required to mandatorily obtain a registration. Now, let us look at certain transactions and understand what would be the case when it comes to registration in case of such transactions, right? First transaction, first example that I would take is a transaction of renting of property. I am a senior citizen. I have a property. I have a property in which I have invested and I have rented out this property. Now, when I've rented out this property is earning me some rent. Rent is a supply as far as GST is concerned. Rent can be of two kinds. One, it could be a rent coming out of a residential property, or second, a rent arising out of a commercial property. For our purpose, we will assume it to be commercial rent because the residential rent is exempt under GST, as we all know. So once we are assuming it to be the commercial rent, then it becomes a taxable supply to that extent. So he is earning rent out of a commercial property, and along with it, being a senior citizen, he also has some savings which he has parked in a bank FD. So he is earning sizable amount of interest income, right? So say, for example, if he is earning 12 lakhs as rent from that commercial property, and maybe another 20 lakhs as interest income from the FD that he has, then whether in such cases, would liability to register arise, or would there be no liability to register? Reason to ask you this question is that in totality, if I take the total amount that I'm looking at is 20 lakhs plus 12 lakhs of rent, 20 lakhs of interest plus 12 lakhs of rent. Per se, since the taxable supply, which is the rent from commercial property, is less than 12 lakhs, I have not crossed the limit of registration of 20 lakhs. It is only if I'm required to include this interest income would in such a case be there a liability to register, because then the 20 plus 12 would make it a 32 lakh transaction, and having exceeded the limit of 20 lakhs, I would have to take registration. Now, please understand, the moment I take registration, even if I take a voluntary registration, I am treated at the same footing as any other person who has registration, right? So many times this question comes to us, many people ask us this query that I have taken voluntary registration. I did not cross that limit of 20 lakhs. I took registration much before that. So say, for example, as soon as I crossed 5 lakhs, I went ahead and took a registration. Now, after taking this registration, would that next 1 lakh, which would make me reach 6 lakhs of turnover, would be liable for tax under GST? Answer to this question is yes, because the moment you've taken registration, from that day, all the invoices that you issue, all the transactions that you enter into would now become taxable transactions and would make you liable to pay tax to the government. So once you've taken a registration, please understand you are required to follow the provisions of GST, and everything that you do is taxable unless there is a specific exemption or it doesn't fall under the definition of supply. So as I said, if I look at this transaction, interest income, if you all know, there has been a notification issued which says that interest income is exempt. The main transaction was, giving the money to the bank, which I have already said is not a supply. So per se, the transaction was not a supply. The amount that I've earned out of giving the money is also exempt. However, the question that arises is whether exempt supplies is to be included in the aggregate turnover. As we have already discussed, exempt supplies is also required to be included in the aggregate turnover. So thereby, this 20 lakhs would get added to the 12 lakhs and make that person liable to registration. So in many cases, we have seen that a lot of people don't pay attention to this provision. They simply look at the taxable turnover and say that ठीक है, आपका 12 लाख का rent है, आपको registration लेने का GST में जरूरत नहीं है. But technically, if the officer goes through your records, if he probably looks at your income tax return, or if he looks at your form 26As, he would be quickly able to assess that you were liable to registration and you've avoided tax on the renting transaction. Example 2 I've already covered while discussing example 1. I'm taking the third example, which is again similar to the first example that I've already taken now. In this case, the only difference is I'm a senior citizen. I have a commercial property which I've rented out. This commercial property is again earning me 12 lakhs of rent. But apart from that, I have some investment in shares. Whether this investment in shares would make me liable to registration or not. So say, for example, if I have an investment in shares of 20 lakh rupees, I've earned some 20 lakhs of dividend and capital gains. Then would this 20 lakhs of dividend and capital gains, along with 12 lakhs of rent, make that rent liable to registration? Because as such, dividend is not supply under GST. And similarly, purchase and sale of shares, as I've already clarified, is again not a transaction which is a supply under GST. So in such cases, what is the answer? The answer here would be, again, that sale of shares is not a supply transaction. If you go to the earlier slide, we had categorically said that something that is not a supply is not required to be included in the aggregate turnover definition. Thereby, this amount of 20 lakhs from dividends and capital gains is safely excluded from the aggregate turnover, and thereby the 12 lakhs of rent from the commercial property is also not something that would make the person liable to registration and would thereby not attract GST. Now, adding some more flavor to this transaction, whether these shares that I was holding, it could be possible that I'm holding these shares as investment, as well as a part of it is also held as stock in trade, right? So under my income tax return, I have reported it under capital gains also, and I've reported some income under business income also. Now, if the nature and intent is clear, and it is coming out also from my income tax return, that certain shares were held as investment and certain shares were held as stock in trade, would that change the situation of including the transactions of sale of shares under the definition of aggregate turnover? Again, the answer to this is the same as answer to the earlier question. GST does not categorize or delve into the nature of investment as such. Whether you have kept those shares as an investment or whether those shares were held with the intent of using them as stock in trade and trading regularly in the stock markets, that doesn't make any bit of difference under GST law. Crux, the essence of the transaction is that these are transactions of sale of shares. Shares are neither goods nor service, and thereby the nature, the intent with which these shares are held would not make any difference, and they would not be required to be included in the definition of aggregate turnover, right? I'll repeat, even the stock in trade in respect of shares will not form part of your aggregate turnover, and obviously, so to say, then not be liable to tax as well. The last and the most important thing that I need to bring to your attention is that whenever you're doing export of goods, in that case, if I'm a 100% exporter, when we go ahead, we'll come to this particular rule, which has been defined by the government, stating that export, or rather, sorry, whenever you're dealing in purely exempt items, then in that case, those non-taxable and exempt items, if it forms 100% part of, if it forms part of 100% of your turnover, then in that case, you're not required to take any registration, right? Now, as I said, many people many times get confused and they interpret exports of goods or services as exempt transactions. Please understand, these are not exempt. These are, as I said, zero rated supplies. Export of goods or export of services comes with certain conditions. So much more important than understanding zero rated supplies is this concept that you need to understand. Export of goods or export of service, just by virtue of the fact that they have gone outside India, does not make them exempt under GST. There are certain more conditions. So whenever we say we are exporting services, we are exporting goods without payment of tax, there is another condition that you need to do it under a letter of undertaking. Now you need the furnishing of letter of undertaking. You need to furnish letter of undertaking, right? So to furnish this letter of undertaking, again, you will have to take a registration. So thereby, it is important for us to understand that whenever you're doing an export transaction and your turnover is 100% comprising only of export of goods or services, even in such cases, despite there being no tax liability, despite there being no visibility of tax liability in the future, you will still have to go ahead and take a registration, as registration is compulsory to understand for the officer that you have complied with the law in terms of meeting other conditions. Going to the other aspect, whenever there is a transfer of business or whenever there is an amalgamation or demerger, in that case, what happens is one business is closing down and there is another business that is coming into effect. So thereby, in such cases, registration will also need to be transferred, right? So on which date are you going to take registration? Because you will need to count that limit of 30 days from the date of you becoming liable for registration. So it has been defined that whenever you're talking about transfer of business, whether it is on account of succession or sale or any other reason, then in that case, the date on which you consider that business has having been transferred, that will be the date on which it will be understood as the date of transfer, right? Whenever, now it is possible that you're doing transfer in piecemeal, in tranches, right? So in such cases, the government has said that we will interpret the limit of 30 days liberally. And in the circular, they've said that whichever date you want to consider as a date of transfer, whichever trench you want to consider was the last trench, which is making that entire transfer complete in respect of that particular business, would be regarded as a date of transfer. And from that date, within 30 days, you need to take a registration. For amalgamation or demerger, it's not such a complicated exercise, because what happens is you go to the High Court gives you the order, and in that case, basis the High Court order, there is a fresh certificate of incorporation which is processed and issued by the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. So the certificate of incorporation will contain a date from the date of which the amalgamation or demerger has come into being. That date is what is regarded as the date from which you will have to count 30 days. Now, as I said, to take registration, you will need to also decide thirdly the state in which you need to take registration. Now, when we come to goods, it is easy to do that because they are tangible and supply can be easily identified. So you can easily see the location from which goods are being supplied, and thereby the goods can be attributed to a particular state and you can take registration in that particular state. Whenever it comes to service, it becomes a bit difficult because it is an intangible transaction. Now, thereby, they have come up with rules to define where is the service rendered. Whenever you're rendering service from a registered place of business, that registered place from where you've rendered the service is the place from where which it will be deemed to have been supplied. And that place, since it's already registered, will be the place of business. If you don't have a registration and you're supplying services, then in that case, the intent is to see which is that location, which is that establishment, which is directly concerned with the provision of service. Where are the resources located which are required to provide the service? And that is the place for which you will have to take a registration. Again, if you are saying that it's not just one place from where I'm providing the service, I'm providing the services from multiple places, then again, you will need to come back and ascertain which is the place which is most directly concerned with the provision of service. Try and identify the place which still has maximum amount of connection with the supply. And that is the place for which you will have to take a registration. If nothing else works, the usual place of residence, because in some cases you might not have a place of business, you might not have anything, you're just operating, maybe as a freelancer or something. And thereby, in such cases, since you don't have a fixed place of business, etc., the residence is where you will be deemed to have been providing services from. Coming to the other part of mandatory registration, one part was I having exceeded the turnover. As I said, the government has also come out with certain categories of people who will be required to take registration, even if they have not crossed that limit of 20 lakhs. Now, who are those people? Let us just look at these items and understand. Anyone who is making interstate supplies. So we all know the difference between intrastate and interstate. Whenever there's a dealing between two states, whenever the transaction involves people located across two different states or the goods are moving across two different states, it's an interstate transaction. Whenever you have entered into an interstate transaction, the registration that is required to be taken is mandatory in nature. So I might have done, maybe 10 lakhs of intrastate turnover and just 1 lakh of interstate turnover. But that 1 lakh of interstate supplies would make me liable for mandatory registration and also make me liable to pay tax on the 10 lakhs of intrastate supplies. There is an exception to this rule. They've said that if you are into interstate supply of services, so where you are supplying services and you don't exceed the aggregate turnover limit of 20 lakhs, then in such cases, your interstate supplies of services below this aggregate turnover of 20 lakhs would not make you liable for registration. So for service providers, they have given an exception saying that if you are a service provider providing less than 20 lakhs of services and you are providing interstate supply services also, yet in that case, you don't need to go ahead and take a registration. Similarly, in case of goods, they have come out with 2-3 categories. One is that if I'm supplying specified handicraft products, in such cases, you don't need to take a registration as long as you don't exceed the aggregate turnover. So for interstate supplies of handicrafts below the aggregate turnover limit, they have exempted those particular handicraft suppliers from mandatory registration requirement. Again, for agriculturists, anyone who is an agriculturist and who is into interstate supply does not need to take a registration because agriculture and agriculturist products are basically exempt. Next category is non-resident taxable person. So if I'm a person who is not residing in India, but coming on and off to India and rendering my services or providing, goods in India, buying goods from India and supplying to someone in India, or getting goods from abroad and coming to India and then supplying those goods in India, then basically what I'm doing is I'm not having a fixed nature of business. I come on one particular day, do that business for 3-4 days, go back. Again, I might come after 8-10 months, do that business. So as you all know, such people are non-resident taxable persons. But since they're coming to India for temporary period, they will be mandatorily required to take registration. There is a different procedure to take registration. So if I have to talk practically about it, it's a different procedure, because generally for resident persons who are going for a registration, the PAN is a mandatory requirement. However, for non-resident taxable person, PAN will not be a mandatory requirement. They have done away with the requirement of PAN, and they can take registration on the basis of some other document, maybe their passport number or their tax identification number abroad, which can be used to take the registration, right? So they have made certain exceptions, and they have a different procedure on their website for non-resident taxable persons. Third is the casual taxable person, which is again similar to the non-resident taxable person. So casual taxable person is, say, for example, someone who just goes to one particular state, makes some supply of goods and services, and comes back to his own state. Then again, after some amount of time, he'll go back, make some supplies in another state, and come back. So he's not having regular dealings with those states. Such people are called as casual taxable persons. These casual taxable persons are also mandatorily required to get registered. There are two exceptions in this. One, as we discussed, is a case of handicraft supplies. So certain handicrafts, when they are supplied by persons who are categorized as casual taxable persons, then these persons don't need to take registration in respect of supply of those handicraft products, specified handicraft products. Similarly, when we are talking about casual taxable person, what we also need to understand is that there are one more category of casual taxable persons who don't need to take a registration. Those are, just one moment, let me recollect. I just lost my thought. So yeah. So basically, those persons who are again into e-commerce, right? So those persons are again exempt from this requirement. And thirdly, when we count a casual taxable person, casual taxable persons, when we are dealing with these casual taxable persons, please understand what happens is this third category, which I was going to discuss, are those people who are basically, I don't know whether I should say door-to-door selling. Maybe not. Door-to-door selling is not the right word. But what they do is basically, I go to a particular state, I identify buyers in that particular state only after reaching that particular state. I don't know who is the actual consumer of my product. So in such cases, what happens is that when I am departing with the goods from the original state where I'm registered, I don't know to whom I should do the billing. In such cases, what happens is that since I don't know the person to whom I need to do the billing, I will not be able to bill the invoice. I will not be able to make the invoice. When I say build the invoice, I will not be able to make an invoice. Neither will I be able to generate an e-way bill, right? So in such cases, the government has relaxed the procedure and said that if I am a casual taxable person who is going to a particular state and then deciding to whom I need to make a supply in that particular state, in such cases, I have been given the exception of raising an e-way bill under delivery mode, right? So I will raise a delivery e-way bill and just say that I am sending the goods from one state to another state, or I'm taking the goods with me from one state to another state. The moment I identify a buyer in that particular state, I will then using my original GST number, not a GST number as a casual taxable person, right? So ideally what you need to do is when you reach the other, when you are basically making very rare supplies in another state, you will need to follow the provisions of casual taxable person, take a temporary number in that state. While taking the temporary number in that state, you will be asked to deposit an advance amount. An advance tax payment will be required to be done by you before the registration is granted to you, right? So that is the difference between the casual taxable person registration and a normal registration, where you are not required to estimate your liability, pay tax, etc. And this number is also, as you know, valid only for a limited period of time. Now, I have not followed that procedure of casual taxable person when I went to that other state, because I did not know my estimated liability. So the government, having understood this particular peculiarity in the transaction, has waived off that procedure and said that you just need to issue an e-way bill under the delivery mode. Once you have found a buyer in that particular state, issue the invoice using your original GST number, which was a regular GST number, right? So such procedure can be followed by people who are going to a particular state and then identifying to whom they are required to make the supplies. Next is the case of persons who are under reverse charge mechanism. Now, obviously, as we know, people who are under reverse charge mechanism would need to take a mandatory registration. Otherwise, they will not be able to follow the provisions of reverse charge mechanism. So all the specified categories of person who are under RCM, I'm not getting into that. They are required to compulsorily take registration. Fourth or the fifth category is the TDS deductors. Now, this TDS, I don't know how many of you know, but how we have income tax TDS, similarly, we also have GST TDS. There are certain category of persons who have been defined and are required to deduct TDS. Mainly, if I'm to talk about these, essentially, these are basically government or government organizations. So whenever there is a dealing between the government and the bill is being issued to a government authority or a government entity, in such cases, while giving you the payment, while remitting the payment to you, they will deduct TDS under GST, right? Now, in order to comply with the provisions under GST law, they will also have to mandatorily take registration. Brokers or agents. Again, as I said, when it comes to a principal-agent relationship, the principal-agent relationship can also make a person liable to registration, and thereby, in order to track such transactions between the principal and the agents are also required to mandatorily obtain registration. Vendors on e-commerce platform. So next category is all those people who are supplying goods from e-commerce platforms like, say, for example, Amazon or Flipkart. So in such cases, it is not the e-commerce platform. It is not Amazon or Flipkart which is making the supply. It is a transaction between two different parties, not the e-commerce platform, right? So all those people who are using the services of the e-commerce platform to sell their goods or services, these are the persons who are also mandatorily required to get registered irrespective of their turnover limit. Then next is the e-commerce operator themselves. Now, I don't know again how many of you know, but whenever we talk about e-commerce operator, these e-commerce operators, as I said, are basically just enabling the service, right? They are just enabling the transaction of goods or services. In such cases, the transactions which are enabled to their platform again suffer a TCS. How you have TCS under income tax, there is a concept of TDS also under GST, and there's a concept of TCS also under GST. So whenever we talk about e-commerce transactions, e-commerce operators are required to deduct TCS from the amount that they are going to remit to the vendor on their platform. Now, again, in order to comply with this TCS provisions, it is required for them to take registration irrespective of the threshold limit. So whenever we are talking about e-commerce platform, the vendor will also need to compulsorily get registered, and the platform provider will also need to have a compulsory registration without looking into the turnover. Next category is the online information and database access or retrieval services. People providing online information or database access and retrieval are also required to mandatorily take registration. Examples of such services could be cloud services, services of providing e-books, etc., music, etc., over the internet. So all these content which is lying on a particular, server on the internet, and you are given a platform to access that information or that service or that content, including the OTT platforms, etc. All these are covered under this OIDAR category. Now, these people are also required to mandatorily take registration irrespective of their threshold limit. And last is the ISD service. If I am into providing input service, if I am an input service distributor and I want to provide services of ISD to my other units, then in that case, again, I will be required to mandatorily obtain registration in order to distribute credit. Again, here, one important point to note, I'll not get into the specifics of ISD, but please remember, when we are talking about ISD, we are only talking about distribution of credit of service, distribution of ITC on services. Inputs cannot be distributed using ISD because it is a tangible product. You can identify to which location the goods have gone. So you don't need ISD for that. I think I've already covered the content on this slide. Now, as I said, what is also important to note is that the registration is a state-specific registration. The government has said that a person can take only one registration in a particular state, right? So whenever you apply for a second registration in that particular state, the government is going to ask you for a reason why you want a second registration. The second registration can be taken for one reason that, the location from which I'm providing goods or services is one other location as compared to the new location that I am using now to provide services. So if there are two different locations within the same state, you are well entitled to get two registrations within the same state. However, even if you have just one location in a particular state, but if you have two different business segments, then in that case, again, you can take a registration for the same location and the government will grant you that registration if you satisfy the officer that you have two different business segments. I might have two different products. I might have one goods or one service which I'm providing from that location. Or it could be that, two different, geographical locations are catered by the same business that I have. So whatever segmental report that you have prepared or whatever segments you have under your accounting standards, you can use that to justify your second registration. With this, I have covered provisions relating to mandatory registration. Now, just trying to look at the reasons why someone would want to go for voluntary registration. Now, I have listed on 3-4 reasons, which are generally typically the reasons why probably someone would want to take voluntary registration. One is obviously for claiming ITC. Second is in order to comply with the customer's requirement. There are customers who insist on certain ISO requirements, etc. In such cases, they say that our policy is to not to deal with unregistered vendors under GST. So that might force you to take a registration. In order also for you to have efficiency, the commercial efficiency in the transaction, you will be required to take GST registration more or less in line with claiming of ITC, because if you lose that ITC, it will make the goods costlier to that extent, and thereby it will not have efficiency, or you will lose a competing efficiency that you have, competing advantage that you have at the end consumer end. So that could be one reason. And as I said, ISD could be another reason in order to distribute a credit to particular locations. Procedure of registration as such, I think every one of us is familiar. It is very simple. You have to fill the registration form. Once you fill the registration form, giving various particulars, which are basically nothing but your simple particulars as far as your business is concerned. It would be your directors or partner details or any other key person who is going to be managing the business and filing the GST returns. It would be the address where you want the registration. It also require you to include details of other registrations that you have already taken. And you also need to furnish details of other GST numbers that you have. Now, please understand practically this, furnishing of other GST numbers is day by day becoming very important because of the frauds that have happened in the past. Authorities are looking at everything very suspiciously. You would have probably, if you have done a recent registration, and if you are taking a number with the same PAN, second number with the same PAN, then in that case, you would see a screen flashing on your computer saying that, you already have one number and this is the number and this is the status of that number. Because in the past, what has happened is people have taken multiple numbers and they have used those numbers to cause fraud on the government, right? So whenever you're taking registration, disclose all the numbers, especially any numbers that you have within that state. Once you've completed all the particulars and uploaded necessary documents, the officer gets 7 working days to approve the application. If he is satisfied with the application, he will approve it within 7 working days, you will get a certificate. If he is unhappy with the application, he wants you to give some more data or documents, he will issue a notice. You will have to reply to that notice and he will again process it within 7 working days, right? Now, if he does not take any action after 7 working days also, then in that case, there is a deemed registration concept. The system will auto approve the registration, right? Another thing that is important is Aadhaar authentication. This is a new thing that has come over the past 1 year or so. Any registration application which has not been completed using Aadhaar authentication will go for mandatory physical verification. So only if you've done your Aadhaar authentication, if it's a proprietor of the proprietor or if it's a non-proprietor entity of whoever is the authorized person who is going to be signing the GST returns, as well as one more partner. So you will need to complete the Aadhaar authentication in respect of these people. If you don't do so within 15 days of submitting the application, it will be deemed that you don't want to go for Aadhaar authentication and the system will automatically take it under manual processing with physical verification required. The officer gets 30 days of time to visit your premise and verify the premise and the person who has been assigned as the authorized signatory. And once he is satisfied about these 2 aspects, only then will he approve the application. So it becomes quite a long-term process and thereby it is always recommended to complete the Aadhaar authentication. Once you submit the application, you will get a different link on your email and mobile. You will get links to complete the Aadhaar authentication. Using any one of those links, you will be able to log on to the GST website, give them the OTP, etc. And the Aadhaar OTP, which will come on your mobile number linked to your Aadhaar, will be validated and application will be taken up for further processing. Until you complete this step, you will not get an ARN. ARN is basically acknowledgement of registration application, right? So until you complete this particular step of Aadhaar authentication, your application is not going to move forward, as I said. It will be stuck. If it's stuck for 15 days or more, as I said, it will be automatically taken up for physical verification. As I said, practically what we are experiencing is most of the cases, there is a notice these days which are more frequently issued. Earlier we were not questioned. I think there is one query which says that we have to upload leave and license agreement in case of principal business, where registration is for proprietor whom PTEC is already there, but PT number is wrongly obtained on his other partnership firm. What is the solution? Now see, this rent agreement issue has been cropping up every now and then. We have ourselves experienced it and we have heard these complaints from a lot of people. It is mandatory to upload the rent agreement. Without the rent agreement, they are not giving the registration applications. There have been cases where the premise is owned by the proprietor or premise is owned by one of the partners. Even in such cases, they are insisting on a rent agreement, or if there is no rent agreement because it's not a commercial nature arrangement, then they are saying that you need to upload an NOC which is duly notarized. Okay, so again, there is no laid down procedure. It's nowhere defined what are the documentation requirements which are required. The bare minimum documentation requirements that are flashed on your screen, that flash on your screen when you take the registration, those category of documents are the only documents that per se are required. Beyond that, It is only maybe as a matter of abundant precaution that the officers are asking for documents. I'm sure many of you will say that we have tried registration once, second it got rejected. We tried registration, second time it got rejected. And with more or less the same set of documents, when we tried for the third time, it got approved. These kind of problems have been happening in the past. And honestly, if you ask me practically, there is no solution to this, because when you're taking a registration, you want that registration effective immediately. At that point of time, you don't even have any appellate mechanism. You don't even know the officer to whom the registration is going. Even if you know the officer, you can only approach him and ask him whatever is the query he has raised. But as long as you don't answer that query, he will not be satisfied and he will not approve your application. So in such cases, I think more or less every one of us is helpless. We are also doing what you are doing. If it is not getting approved, we try and give as many documents as it is feasible for us to give. If it gets rejected, we have to live with it and we have to furnish another application. Second problem that has been, a sore point since day one is that when we see the law, when we read the law, it is said that registration can be taken within 30 days of you getting liable to register, right? So what I'm talking about is a case, say for example, my turnover crossed the aggregate turnover threshold on 28th of April. That is today, say for example, I crossed that limit of 20 lakhs. I will not be able to practically, it is impossible for me to comply with the law today itself. So I will make an application maybe tomorrow or maybe in 5-7 days, because law has given me 30 days of time. After me making that application also, it will take time for the officer to verify and approve that application. When I furnish the application, they ask me for an effective date from which my liability started, right? I will furnish 28 April as that date. The law says that if you have obtained registration within that 30 days of permissible time limit, your registration will be effective from the date you have mentioned in the application as your date on which you were liable to register. However, practically it is seen that your registrations are not getting backdated. Our registration will only start from that date on which the officer has approved the application, right? It's not even on the date when you filed the application. It's going to be a date on which the application is approved. So considering a case where, I exceeded my liability in April, I will have to now start issuing invoices from April onwards, right? So those invoices which I issued on 28th, 29th, 30th, I would not have means to report that, because my first tax period that would open up in the system is May, right? So in May, I cannot report it again. So typically what happens is, if you've already had a regular registration, you can report earlier period invoices also in GSTR1. However, there is a control, there's a check in the system that your invoice, which is earlier than your registration date, cannot be reported. If you try and do that, GSTR1 will reject it. So even by that means, I cannot furnish an April invoice in May and make good my compliance. So these are probably problems which every one of us is facing. And honestly, we are also as helpless. Any proprietor who has converted into partnership, I think the law is clear in that case. What you need to do, as far as GST is concerned, the procedure is clear. What you need to do is you need to take registration for the partnership firm. When you take registration for the partnership firm, you will, after you get that registration certificate, after that only please go and apply for cancellation of the proprietor GST registration number. How to cancel GST number, we'll discuss in the subsequent part of the presentation. But again, that's a very simple thing to do. You can just go to the services menu under GST, and there will be an option for cancellation. Fill in the required form, the form which is there for cancellation. You will be asked for certain details. Once you fill those up, your application will be taken up for cancellation. Only one important thing that you need to keep in mind when you are cancelling a number to change the constitution of your business is that you need to give in the cancellation application the new GST number that you obtained for the partnership firm. Why it is necessary is again to transfer your credits. If you want to transfer your ITC balance from proprietor to partnership, then in that case, only if you indicate this, GST, new GST number in the cancellation application, will they allow you to transition the old credit from the old number to the new number. Apart from this, you will need to file form ITC 02 in order to transition the credit. So not only will you have to mention it in the cancellation application, you will also have to file using the new GST login, the ITC 02 form. And once they have verified the ITC 02 form and approved it, you will get that balance in your electronic credit ledger. Okay, I'll take up the remaining queries maybe a bit later. Registered rent agreement required. I just saw that. I don't know. There is no such requirement because the law of registration is also clear. It says any agreement which is for 12 months or more is only required to get registered. So ideally, GST cannot enforce a law which is the general law of the country. It cannot go beyond that. But yes, there are such issues coming up. If you want, we have been successful in getting registrations to unregistered agreement, but as I said, they had to be notarized. They had to be notarized with a registry number of the notary, right? So just a normal notary would not do. Please don't go for normal notary. They will insist for the registry number also in the notary register.
Sorry, Ashish sir, I'll interrupt in between. We can take the queries at later, not an issue, at the end of the session.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
Right. The last part is the simplest part of the registration provisions, although it is the most harshest part, where the officer has come and forced you to take a registration. As I said, it is an exceptional case where you have not complied with the law. Since you have not complied with the law, the officer was forced to give you a registration, right? So I will not be discussing much on this because what is typically the procedure is that he will issue you a notice as to why you should be asked to register and why you have not taken registration until now. You will be required to respond to that notice in terms of principles of natural justice. And once you have responded, he will process and decide your case accordingly. I'm not getting into amendment of registration certificate because I think that is a fairly, as I said, there are notices that are coming when you apply for amendment of registration certificate, but those are procedural in nature. And as I said, there are no honestly solutions. So if there's a particular issue, you can maybe we can take up in the question and answer part, or maybe you can write to me categorically or specifically to me on my email address, and I will try and resolve those issues to the best of my experience. Now, coming on to the second part of this presentation, as I said, it is about after you haven't taken the number, there are cases where you might be required to cancel the number. Now, what are the reasons why you might want to cancel the number? One, and the most common is you've discontinued the business. When I talk about discontinuance of business, it could be on account of transfer of business, it could be on account of debt, it could be on account of amalgamation or demerger, or it could be on account of sale of the business. In any of these cases, since the business has discontinued, you would want to cancel the GST number for that particular business. If there's a change in constitution of the business also, again, more or less it is discontinuation of the earlier business and you will want to continue a new business. So I will treat it in the same category. And I've already discussed the procedure that you will be required to follow for changing the constitution of the business. The last is probably where you feel that now I have gone below the threshold limit of 20 lakhs and thereby I want to cancel the number, right? In all such cases, as I said, you can go and cancel the number. Under the services menu of the GST login, you will be able to find the option for cancellation of registration. Now, what I discussed was where, again, you wanted to cancel the number. As I said, where we spoke about registration also, there were provisions which were in favor of the officer where he was forcing you to take the number. Similarly, there are provisions which enable the officer to cancel your number again on account of certain non-compliances only. right? So whenever we are talking about these provisions, there is a inherent assumption that officer is proceeding to cancel the number because of certain issues that he has. Since there are issues, he will issue you a show cause notice asking you to provide your reason for requesting him not to cancel the number. You can reply to that notice, and upon adjudication of that notice, your case will be decided. Otherwise, if you don't give notice, reply to the notice, it will be treated as you have nothing to say and the number will be cancelled. What will be the date of cancellation? Again, that is something that the officer will decide. When you are furnishing cancellation application, in your cancellation application, there will be a column where you can write from which date you want to cancel the number. However, if the officer is proceeding to cancel on his own, then in that case, he will again mention in the show cause notice also, and in the order also, there will be a date of cancellation that will be given. Now, REG 16 is the form that you have to file within 30 days of any of these events having gotten attracted, right? But practically, I think with GST, since it's system-driven law, as Srikanji said, most of us don't really care about the application numbers. All you need to do is go to the relevant menu. The form will automatically appear before you, and all you need to do is take care of the particulars that you need to fill. So I will spend a bit of time on the particulars that you will be required or asked to fill. You will be asked to fill your basic details as to why you want to cancel the number, etc. Apart from that, one very important detail which you will be required to fill is your amount of stock. So if you're into goods, you will be required to report the stock lying with you on the date preceding the date of cancellation, right? So on the date preceding the date of cancellation application, whatever was the stock at the end of the day in respect of raw materials, semi-finished goods or finished goods, you will need to report that in the application. Along with reporting that, you will also need to report that when you purchase this stock, what was the amount of ITC that you availed in respect of those items. This is required to be furnished because now you're cancelling the number. So since there will be no nexus between your inputs and outputs, the amount that you took as credit in respect of those supplies, whether it was inputs, semi-finished goods, or finished products, all that amount of credit will now be required to be reversed. Now, when I'm talking about reversal also, please understand reversal could be in two ways. One would be an actual reversal where the amount of balance that is left with you in the ITC register is what you need to debit. However, in case there is not sufficient amount in the ITC ledger, in the credit ledger, then in that case, you will be required to make a cash payment. And after you make the cash payment, you can apply for cancellation. There's a circular also, however, which says that cash payment need not be insisted upon when you file GST REG 16. When you make the cancellation application, at that point of time, it is not mandatory for you to make the cash payment, and you can defer it to the time when you get the final order of cancellation, right? So you can make use of that circular. Apart from your regular raw materials or stock items, please also understand you might have taken credit in respect of certain capital goods you would have purchased, which are lying in your fixed assets, right? So all those items in your fixed assets in your balance sheet is also what you will need to revisit. And you would have to see that in terms of the rules under GST, there is a specific amount of percentage given for every period of use of capital goods. So that much ITC in respect of capital goods will also need it to be reversed. So you will have to look at your date of purchase of capital goods, calculate the date on which you are cancelling the registration, and thereby total period for which you were holding these capital goods. So the total period for which these capital goods were held is what you will need to then relate to the reversal percentage that is defined under the GST law. Correct? So once you have reversed the credit on raw materials, finished goods, semi-finished goods, and capital goods, then you can finally proceed to the next set of columns, which are basically, as I said, from which date you want to get the registration cancelled. So you can apply for cancellation from a future date. You can also specify that post cancellation, I want the credit to be transferred, the remaining credit to be transferred to any other GST number because there has been a transfer of business or a change in constitution, etc. Right? So all those columns will come up where you will be required to furnish those details. And finally, you will need to give the name of the person who is applying for the cancellation, the future correspondence address and contact details where the officer can reach you if that current contact details will stop being valid after you apply for the cancellation. So these are some general details, as I said, which you will need to furnish while applying for cancellation of registration. Now, please understand one important thing. Again, this is a change since 2019. It was not there earlier. Whenever you file an application for cancellation, your registration will be put under suspension mode. Meaning to say, it is not cancelled. It has been just made inactive. It's in an inactive state. Now, during this state of inactivity, you are not required to comply with the provisions of GST law. You're not required to file returns. Not only that, you are not entitled to even issue any GST invoice or take any more ITC, right? So as soon as you file the application for cancellation, you will see all other facilities, all other features on the GST portal will get deactivated as far as they are related to regular compliances, right? This is because the government was facing this issue where a lot of people were complaining that after applying for cancellation also, since it took 30 days of time or something, we did not complete the formalities. We were not wanting to do that because we were already not having any liability. And to asking us to comply with the law is putting further burden on us. So we don't want to go through this burden once we have applied for cancellation. So thereby the government came out with a facility saying that we will suspend your registration. If your application is decided in your favor, you will be granted permanent cancellation. If you are not given cancellation order, your suspension will be revoked automatically by the system and your normal functioning would be restored, right? So you will have to again start complying with whatever GST law compliances you were doing earlier. So this is one important change. This suspension of registration would also happen if the officer has suo motu initiated cancellation from his side, right? So as soon as he issues your notice proposing to cancel your registration, again in such a scenario, your registration is put on suspension mode. One very important thing to understand over here is that when your registration is put on suspension mode, since you cannot issue tax invoices and you cannot file GST-1, etc., you will not be able to pass on credit, right? So a lot of people have started experiencing these difficulties that for whatever defaults we have made, we have gotten a notice of cancellation, and which has not only now made me liable for cancellation, it has stopped immediate operations, right? Because my business operation comes to a halt. Please understand, however, that when you are getting a notice of cancellation and along with that you get a notice of suspension, your suspension notice does not have any principles of natural justice built in. Only for your cancellation notice, you will be afforded an opportunity of being heard. आप जाके तभी अपना रिप्लाई फाइल कर सकते हो जब आपका कैंसिलेशन की बात हो रही है. सस्पेंशन के लिए ऑफिसर डज नॉट नीड टू कम टू यू and ask you why I should not cancel or why I should not, suspend your registration. Okay, that is an absolute right with the officer, and there is no opportunity of being heard which is required to be given. Right now, having understood basic aspects of cancellation and suspension, just let us look at the possible contraventions which can result in cancellation from the officer's side. One, generic nature is obviously any kind of contravention of any provision under the GST law. So if you have not complied with any of the provisions of GST law, you are liable for cancellation. Apart from that, if you fail to file 3 consecutive returns, then in that case, again, you are liable for cancellation, right? So I think this is a bit misworded over here. A regular dealer who has not filed 3 consecutive returns will become liable for cancellation, and a composition dealer who has not furnished returns for 6 months consecutively, right? They're talking about 6 months over here and not 6 tax periods, because for composition scheme, tax period is a quarterly period, right? So what they're saying is, if you're under composition not filed for 6 months, you are liable for cancellation. One more important thing to notice over here is, you took a voluntary registration, but you did not start only business within 6 months of taking registration. Then again, the officer has the right to approach you and ask why your number should not be cancelled, right? So apart from this, if there is any fraud or misstatement, etc., that is noticed, then that will make you liable for cancellation. Now, currently, the burning issue is a lot of notices are being issued where, there is a mismatch between the returns. When I talk about mismatch between the returns, what I'm essentially talking about is mismatch in the amounts stated in GSTR 1, GSTR 3B, and GSTR 2A or 2B, as the case may be. Okay. So wherever there are substantial variations between the figures which are, available to the officer, I would say, then in that case, again, the officer reserves the right to serve you a notice for cancellation. So in such cases, the only remedy that lies with the taxpayer or with us as consultants is that you need to reconcile the turnover and satisfy the officer that one of the turnovers that you've stated is correct. Any other turnover that you've stated is different on account of reconciliation issues or for reasons of short payment, and you've made good that short payment, and thereby the GST-IN should not get cancelled, right? So this is one important reason why your number can get cancelled, and a lot of notices are being issued on this ground, that there is a difference between your GSTR 3B credit and GSTR 2A credit, or your GSTR 1 has higher sales figure as compared to GSTR 3B. All these reasons are, getting you GST notices. Again, this new rule 86B, I don't know how many of us are aware, but yeah, there was this new rule 86B which was introduced, which requires you to, at least in the case of large taxpayers, it requires them to make payment of GST liability in cash to the extent of at least 1%, right? So if someone has not followed that, if he has used entire amount of ITC only to pay the tax liability, then again, the officer could use that offense as the means to approach you for cancellation. One more important thing, I don't know, there was some query also on the bank account front, but when you take registration nowadays, earlier when initially GST had started, the bank account details were contained within the registration application and you could not process the registration without giving the bank details. But now they have made it optional and you can give the bank details after the registration is granted to you. However, after the registration is granted to you, you get a time limit of 45 days to upload those bank details. If you have not uploaded those bank details within 45 days, your number is again liable for cancellation. Right? So, as far as cancellation is concerned, I think in terms of the law, in terms of practical experiences, this is where we are facing challenges. Now, when we are talking about cancellation, one more important aspect that also comes along with it is revocation of cancellation, right? So it is not that the only case of the GST department is that we'll cancel the number and there is no further remedy left after that. Even if your registration has gotten cancelled, you don't need to worry. Please don't, looking at that cancellation order, don't immediately go in and make a fresh application for registration, right? Because that would be, not only would it cause difficulties to you, I understand that taking a fresh registration and leaving behind your old registration would cause difficulties to you also. But forget about the difficulties. It is being viewed in an adverse manner because they are feeling that a lot of people are not going for revocation of cancellation and they're applying or preferring for fresh registration because they don't want to clear the past offenses, right? So if you apply for a fresh number, you will not be granted that fresh number, and in fact, it will be viewed adversely, right? So if you have got an order for cancellation of registration, you are given 3 months of time to approach the officers and get an order of revocation of cancellation. Again, that facility is built in on the website. You can go to the services menu. Under the registration menu, you will get this facility. Apply for revocation of cancellation. You will be asked the reason why you want to apply for cancellation or revocation. If the reason for cancellation was non-furnishing of returns, in such a scenario, you will have to make good all your returns. You will have to pay all the GST liability, and only after that make this application for revocation of the cancellation order, because unless you make good the offense, they will not revoke the cancellation order, right? If your registration was cancelled for any other reason except for non-filing of returns, then you will have to make that application and explain to the officer on that on the grounds on which the registration was cancelled, those grounds have now been taken care of, and thereby you have an opportunity or you have the right to apply for revocation of his cancellation order. Now, looking at the facts in a particular case, obviously, and after giving you an opportunity of representing yourself personally also, he will pass an order of revocation of cancellation order, or he might pass an order rejecting your revocation application. If it's revoked, then well and good. You will go back to the normal system. If it is not granted in your favor, the option that you will have opened for you is to go in for an appeal. Now, typically 3 months of time is what you get to file an appeal. So as I said, from the date of cancellation, you get 30 days to apply for revocation of cancellation to the officer, to the jurisdictional officer. If for some reason you were not able to do that within that first 30 days that you got, you can take condonation of delay, and with the permission of the additional commissioner or commissioner, you can get another 60 days of period to apply for revocation of cancellation order, right? So in totality, you will get around 90 days to apply for revocation of cancellation order. As against that, if you don't want to go through the normal route of applying to the officer for revocation of cancellation, you have another option of going for revocation of cancellation order using the appellate mechanism, right? So you can file form APL 01, file an appeal, and again in the appeal, you will have to satisfy the officer that whatever was the reason for cancellation, that has been taken care of, and thereby your application should be restored, right? Now, even in appeal, please make sure that if it is for reasons of non-filing of returns, you have filed the returns and then gone for appeal, right? So I think with this background in mind, I'm sure you've understood the provisions as far as registration is concerned, as far as cancellation of registration is concerned, as far as suspension of registration is concerned, and as far as revocation is also concerned, right? Now, Shrikant, how much time do I have? Can I take up some queries?
Yeah, sir. What we'll do, I'll read out the query. There are multiple queries from same people also. At least we'll try to address one of the query from each person, I guess.
Yeah, or probably you can take some important queries.
Yeah,
especially some which you have not covered in my presentation.
We'll take up this query by Amit Shah. Sorry, Bhupendra Harshi. Whether director salary, partner salary is to be including for calculating aggregate turnover for registration applicability.
Director's salary, see, as far as directors are concerned, there can be two nature of directorships. One can be the executive director, one can be the non-executive director. As far as executive directors are concerned, the law is settled over here. They are basically employees of the company, and so employer-employee relationship kicks in, and Schedule 3 comes to your rescue. As far as non-executive directors are concerned, they will have to look at their aggregate turnover limit, and if at all you are exceeding the aggregate turnover limit, you will need to take a registration.
Okay.
partners remuneration, again, I think was also another aspect that he had asked, right?
Yeah.
So partners are typically not employees of the company, but again, they are not the people who are providing services to the company. So again, partners remuneration, to my mind, it does not, become a taxable supply. It's not a supply only in the first case, I mean.
Then it's from Vishal Vadera. In case of proprietary who has converted his business into partnership firm, how to cancel GST number? Further, if there is a cash balance pending in this, how to transfer the balance to partnership?
Sorry, Shikan, could you just repeat it once again?
In case of proprietor who has converted his business into partnership firm, then how to cancel the proprietary?
I think I've already taken that up during my presentation.
Whether tax amount paid on behalf of client which are later on reimbursement are to be included in the aggregate turnover.
Tax amounts, they would fall under the category of pure agent. Pure agent is very clear. In fact, if you read the provisions of pure agent as they are contained in the Act, one of the examples of pure agent they have themselves given is this. So I think you can safely exclude it.
Someone is asking for registered rate agreement along with police verification. I don't think so. Police verification.
No. Again, yes, we have seen instances where police verification is being insisted upon. But again, as I said, these are practical issues. There are no circulars, there are no trade circulars, etc. In service tax, we still had some trade circulars which laid down certain uniformity in the document requirements for registration. Since such things are not there in GST, the only way you can, go about this is by, going about and obtaining a police verification report. So probably what you can do is you can submit a letter to the police station and upload the acknowledgement copy, because most of the time the police would not give you a police verification report. But nowadays, even that facility is online to, just file for a police verification. So maybe if you file for that online police verification form, police does not really do anything. They are least bothered about that in most cases. But that could be helpful for you to get the GST number.
Okay, thank you. Kindly explain about the 40 lakhs threshold limit.
40 lakhs threshold limit, yes, this is something that I missed. The 40 lakhs of threshold limit is there to substitute the 20 lakhs of threshold limit, but only if you are a supplier of goods, right? So if you are a supplier of goods and you have absolutely 0 rupees of interstate sale, only then can you resort to this limit of 40 lakhs.
Okay. Then there's one more query. Where a property is taken on rent by XYZ and it is subletted to ABC, whether premises should be added as place of business by XYZ and ABC both?
So as I understand, there is a property which is taken on rent and that is subletted, right?
Yes.
So there are clearly two different transactions. Letting is a different transaction. It is a supply in the first place. Subletting is the second supply. So both will need to be recorded between two different parties between whom it has been entered. There is no dispute on that.
Whether agriculturists are liable for compulsory registration under 24?
No, agriculturalists are making exempt supplies. I've already stated that since all the supplies are exempt in their case, they are not required for taking registration. If only they are having some other taxable supplies, then the agricultural turnover will need to be included and tax would need to be paid on other taxable supplies.
If a professional is providing services around 15 lakhs intrastate and export services are around 2 lakhs, whether you have to obtain a GST registration?
As I said, for export, you will have to mandatorily obtain registration. You don't need to look at the turnover.
Then these are the queries which are much relevant. Others are very this thing which
PPT we can share. I'll share it with the WIRC members and they can probably put it up. Then I'll just look at maybe for another couple of minutes. for other queries which could be
are
relevant. Someone has
few-
asked about bank details not updated.
Yeah, there are few in the chat itself.
Yeah,
Hold on.
but bank details were updated a week before such suo motu cancellation. But pending with officer taking 30 days allowed to reply such cancellation is wrong even after. See, this is I don't know. I think from what you mean in this query is that bank details were earlier not uploaded. You got a notice for cancellation. I think before you got the notice for cancellation or whatever, you made good the default. Basically, what you're trying to say, and you have now requested the officer to revoke the cancellation order or withdraw the suspension, one of the two. And you're saying that basically the officer is not acting promptly. He is taking his own time, which is allowed under the law. And now this is happening. This is happening practically with all of us. Even when you're going for registration, you will feel my registration application is so simple that there is no verification required. I've already done Aadhaar verification, everything. So in proprietor, there is nothing required to be verified. But still the officer will approve it on the last working 7th day only. Typically, you can't do anything about these things. Every one of us are facing these problems that the officers are taking their sweet time. You can go and meet the officer and request him. That is all you can do. At least in cancellation, you can do that. After cancellation, return filing not allowed on the portal from the month of cancellation. So before going for appeal, how to go about it? There is a separate procedure for this. I can give you the entire procedure. Namrata madam, you've asked this. If you can mail on my mailing address your query, I'll reply to it. I'll just share my, probably towards the end of the presentation.
I'm just sharing your email address, sir, in the chat.
Yeah, you can do that. So whoever has these kind of procedural queries, please feel free to mail to me. I will give you the procedure. So online, which menu you have to go and which option you have to choose, you will get all of that. What is the consequence if you have not furnished LUT? For past period, you can't furnish an LUT now online. However, there are circulars which have said that the only default of not furnishing LUT should not result in denial of the essential benefit of export. So probably the only chance you can take is furnish an offline LUT to the officer, and then at least in appeal you should get a favorable decision. I think Shrikantji, we have taken most of the queries now.
We have covered most of the queries.
Yeah, still if there is something left, because of the screen, we can probably not take up every query. We can't see most of them, which are not taken up by us. You can mail me. I think Shrikantji has already shared my email ID. I will try my best to reply to your queries.
Yes. I'll request the participants to mail your queries to sir so that you'll get a better insight from him. So thank you, sir, Ashish sir. I thank you on behalf of all C members, on behalf of WIRC, for your such insightful and valuable guidance for us. To all the participants, you have a good knowledge kitty to share with all. I hope everyone has benefited it. Still, if anyone is having their queries, he's open to the queries. It's really challenging for every GST registered person to maintain his registration because there are many issues which are getting keeping adding on, because everyone has to revert to the queries of the department also. There are many forms which are not yet notified on the online portal, which will also help out all the registered dealers to solve their queries. Only few forms have been functional till date. We hope this was a very insightful session for all the members, and we conclude today's session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shrikantji. Pleasure.